Well, today we come to perhaps the most famous passage in the book of Joshua. We'll be looking at chapter 6, but we'll begin with chapter 5 and verse 13, and we'll read through that amazing story of how, as the old spiritual says, how Joshua fit the battle of Jericho and the walls came a-tumbling down. And we'll see what a mighty God we serve. Joshua chapter 5, beginning with verse 13, reading through chapter 6 and verse 27. This is the word of the Lord. And it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there stood a man over against him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went unto him and said unto him, Art thou for us or for our adversaries? And he said, Nay, but as captain of the host of the Lord am I now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth, and did worship, and said unto him, What saith my Lord unto his servant? And the captain of the Lord's host said unto Joshua, Loose thy shoe from off thy foot, for the place whereon thou standest is holy. And Joshua did so. Now Jericho was straitly, or tightly, shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out, and none came in. And the Lord said unto Joshua, See, I have given into thine hand Jericho, and the king thereof, and the mighty men of valor. And ye shall compass, which means march around, the city, all ye men of war, and go round about the city once. Thou shalt do 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets of ram's horns. And the 7th day ye shall compass the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow with the trumpets. And it shall come to pass that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when ye hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city shall fall down flat, and the people shall ascend up, every man straight before him. And Joshua the son of Nun called the priests, and said unto them, Take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord. And he said unto the people, Pass on, and compass the city, and let him that is armed pass on before the ark of the Lord. And it came to pass, when Joshua had spoken unto the people, that the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns passed on before the Lord, and blew with the trumpets, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord followed them. And the armed men went before the priests that blew the trumpets. And the rear reward, or the rear guard, came after the ark, the priests going on and blowing with the trumpets. And Joshua had commanded the people, saying, Ye shall not shout, nor make any noise with your voice, neither shall any word proceed out of your mouth, until the day I bid you shout. Then shall ye shout. So the ark of the Lord compassed the city, going about it once. And they came into the camp, and lodged in the camp. And Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord, and 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord went on continually, and blew with the trumpets, and the armed men went before them, but the rear guard came after the ark of the Lord, the priests going on and blowing with the trumpets. And the 2nd day they compassed the city once, and returned into the camp. So they did 6 days. And it came to pass on the 7th day, that they rose early about the dawning of the day, and compassed the city after the same manner 7 times. Only on that day they compassed the city 7 times. And it came to pass at the 7th time, when the priests blew with the trumpets, Joshua said unto the people, Shout, for the Lord hath given you the city. And the city shall be accursed, even it and all that are therein, to the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all that are with her in the house, because she hid the messengers that we sent. And ye in any wise keep yourselves from the accursed thing, lest ye make yourselves accursed when ye take of the accursed thing, and make the camp of Israel a curse, and trouble it. But all the silver and gold and vessels of brass and iron are consecrated unto the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord. So the people shouted when the priests blew the trumpets, and it came to pass when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, that the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him. and they took the city. And they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and ox and sheep and ass, with the edge of the sword. But Joshua had said unto the two men that had spied out the country, Go into the harlot's house, and bring out thence the woman and all that she hath, as you swore unto her. And the young men that were spies went in, and brought out Rahab and her father and her mother and her brethren and all that she had. And they brought out all her kindred, and left them without, which means outside, the camp of Israel. And they burnt the city with fire, and all that was therein. Only the silver and the gold and the vessels of brass and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. And Joshua saved Rahab the harlot alive, and her father's household, and all that she had. And she dwelleth in Israel even unto this day, because she hid the messengers which Joshua had sent to spy out Jericho. And Joshua adjured them at that time, saying, Cursed be the man before the Lord that riseth up and buildeth this city Jericho. He shall lay the foundation thereof in his firstborn, meaning in the loss of his firstborn. And in the loss of his youngest son shall he set up the gates of it. So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was noised throughout all the country. Now that is God's word. But that had to be hard for Joshua to believe, right? I mean, we're going to conquer Jericho by walking around the walls and blowing trumpets? Really? Now, Joshua had seen the Lord do some pretty miraculous things. Joshua had walked on dry ground through the Red Sea with a wall of water on his right and on his left. He had eaten manna from heaven. He had led the Israelites in battle against the Amalekites. And on that occasion, he had seen how victory depended not on what happened on the battlefield, but on Moses holding up a staff in the air. When the staff was held aloft, the Israelites were winning. And when the staff was dropped, they were lose. And of course, most recently, he had seen how God had stopped the flow of the Jordan River so that he and all the rest of God's people could cross into the land God had given them. Yes, Joshua had seen God's power displayed in amazing ways, but walking around and around and around the walls of Jericho for 7 days, they had to wonder. For all during that time, Joshua and all the rest of the people of Israel got a good long look at what was for them an impossible problem. They saw the city. Ancient Jericho rested on a great mound of earth. It was encircled at the bottom of the hill with a retaining wall. Okay, so imagine a retaining wall all around the bottom of the hill, 12 to 15 feet high. And on top of that retaining wall was a mud brick wall, 6 feet thick, at least another 20 feet high. Oh, and then on top of the hill was another wall, which surrounded the city itself. And that area on the top of the hill that was surrounded by the second wall was 6 acres large. Now, there's no way these Israelites could penetrate those walls. And if they decided to do the rational thing and set siege to the city, well, the people inside could probably have waited them out. I mean, even today, there is a spring that provides water to the site. And according to chapter 3, this military operation took place during harvest time. So that meant that the people of Jericho would have had lots of food to eat. In fact, some of this grain has been found by modern archaeologists digging at the site, and they estimate that the city could have withstood a siege for years. Oh, and Joshua knew all of this too, because remember the spies who had stayed with Rahab, they had brought a full report back to him. So, as the people of Israel compassed the city, as they walked around and around the city, they knew that the conquest of Jericho was impossible. That fact became more and more clear with each and every step. The more they looked at Jericho, the more they had to wonder about God's promise to tear down those walls. I think we can understand that. Because sometimes it's hard for us to believe God's promises, isn't it? When we are faced with addictions or temptations that seem so overwhelming, God's promises of power seem so vague, so distant. When we are in the middle of difficult relationships, when we struggle with the people who ought to be the closest to us, God's promises of peace seem so weak, so ineffective. When we face chronic illness in ourselves or our loved ones, or even when sickness reaches the point of death, God's promises of comfort and resurrection, well, they seem a bit beside the point, don't they? But the good news is that God does, in fact, keep His promises. The good news is that God can, in fact, do the impossible. And He proved this when He made all the walls around Jericho fall down. And oh yes, the archaeology agrees with the text on this point. Archaeologists working several different digs on the site have found piles of mud bricks outside the foundations of the outer wall and the inner wall. And that means that those walls did collapse outward in all directions, forming ramps that allowed the people to go up into the city, everyone straight from where he was standing. No matter how impossible it may seem, there is no doubt that God kept His word. God kept His word no matter how impossible it may seem to Joshua and to the Israelites. God kept His word, and He didn't need any help from the people to do it. They didn't tear down those walls by walking around them all those times. Oh no. The God who smote the Egyptians with all those plagues, the God who parted the Red Sea, the God who stopped up the Jordan River, the God who spoke the universe into existence, for this God, causing a few mud brick walls to collapse is not a big deal. And we need to remember that. We need to remember that because this same God still promises to be with His people in the midst of our impossible problems today. The same God, the one who broke down the walls of Jericho, can also break down walls of hatred and bitterness, walls of addiction and besetting sin, walls of sickness and death. The same God who gave His people victory over the people of Jericho can give us victory over fear and frustration, over discouragement and despair, over weakness and worry. Whatever our problems may be, no matter how impossible they are for us, none of them are a match for our God. And isn't that good news? It's no wonder we still sing the words of that spiritual and marvel that those walls came a-tumbling down at the will of our God. Oh, but there's something else we find in this text, perhaps something not quite as comforting. For if it didn't really do any good for the people of God to walk around and around that city for 7 days, why did God ask them to do that? Why did they have to wait a week for Him to perform a great miracle, which He could have done in an instant, which He did in an instant? Well, let's imagine, what if Joshua had just told the people about the walls around Jericho, describing how high and how thick they were, the way I described them to you? Or what if God had destroyed those walls just as soon as the people had come in sight of the city, and they didn't get a really good look at them? I'm sure it would still have been a very impressive display of God's power. I mean, just looking at all those bricks that had tumbled down would give you an impression of what God can do. And I'm sure the people would have praised God for performing such an amazing task. But sometimes waiting helps us appreciate God's power. Remember, the people sat by the banks of the Jordan River, that impassable torrent, that flooded river. They sat there for 3 days watching all that water go by. And that experience of those 3 days, seeing that river, had to make the sudden disappearance of those waters even more amazing, didn't it? Just so, walking around those forbidding walls for 7 days had to make the sudden collapse of those walls all the more miraculous. After that week-long walk, there would simply have been no way for the people to deny that only the power of God could have brought those walls down, because they'd gotten a real good look at them. And I wonder if the same thing might also be good for us, whether we like it or not. I wonder if waiting might be good for us. I don't know about you, but when a problem first presents itself to me, my first inclination is to just dive in and think I can solve it myself, and that's what I try. And so it's only after I've run into a few roadblocks that I tend to remember, oh, I need to pray. I need to ask God for help on this one. I can't do this. This is tough. And a lot of times, the longer I wait and the better the look I get at my problems, the deeper my dependence on God becomes. I don't know about you, but that often is the case for me. So what do you think would happen if God were to answer all of our prayers right away? What if God were to solve all of our problems right now? What if we didn't have to persevere in prayer? Would we really know how much we need God? Would we truly trust God as much? Would our praise of Him be as great when He finally does the impossible for us, bringing us the relief that only He can provide? Or does waiting actually help us deepen our dependence on God? Okay, so if it's true that this passage shows us that God has power over problems that are impossible for us, and if it's true that this passage demonstrates that sometimes waiting on God can increase our trust in Him, there's one more thing. There's something else in this story that doesn't make sense, and I don't think we're going to like it very much. Because if it's true that God was going to bring down all those walls by Himself, why did He tell those people to do all that walking? What earthly good did marching around and around and around and around that city do? Okay, all right, so if God just wanted His people to think about and appreciate the impossibility of the problem for 7 days, why didn't He say, okay, y'all all gather around the city, y'all all sit down and y'all stare at it for 7 days? That's what they did by the banks of the Jordan. Why wear out so much shoe leather? Why blow all those trumpets? And why would God tell them never to rebuild the city? I mean, what harm would it do for them to have a strong fortress in a strategic location? They had all the bricks. They could have just rebuilt it. Why would God tell them to destroy everything except for the metal objects? Now remember, we already know the people of Jericho had gathered in at least part of their fall harvest, and they would have had all the summer harvest in as well. So there would be all kinds of fresh food in the city. Oh, and that sure would taste good after all those years in the desert. Oh, and they probably had a lot of livestock inside those walls as well. And wouldn't a barbecue be a great way to celebrate that victory? And remember, God had stopped showering the manna on them as soon as they crossed into the promised land. So God obviously wanted His people to forage off the land. So why should they destroy the very food that God obviously wanted them to eat? What sense did any of this make? I think we can understand that kind of confusion, because doesn't our common sense sometimes contradict what God has told us to do? Doesn't God tell us to do some things that just don't make sense? I mean, think about what we're doing right now. Does it really make sense to come into a room and sit quietly for a whole hour every week praying about our problems instead of getting busy trying to fix them? Does it really make sense for all of us to spend so much time studying passages from a book that's like 4,000 years old, parts of it, 2,000 years old at least, and a 400-year-old translation? Does it really make sense to study this ancient, dusty old book and passages like this that we've already read before? How does a sip of bread and a bite of juice satisfy our hunger and thirst when we take the Lord's Supper? How can washing our bodies with water possibly have any effect on the spiritual uncleanness inside our hearts? No. From a purely practical perspective, from a common sense perspective, none of God's means of grace can do us any earthly good. Why are we here? And what about the way God has told us to live our lives? Does all that make sense? Does it really make sense to take a whole day off every week so we can worship God when we have so many other things to do? Does it really make sense to honor our parents when they obviously have no clue what they're talking about? Does it really make sense to remain faithful to our marriage vows when we don't feel the same way we did on our wedding day? As we read last week, does it really make sense to love our enemies and to make ourselves vulnerable to those who hate us and abuse us? No, none of it makes sense. The fact is that in our sinful world, our heads and our hearts are so often pulling us in directions that God's Word says we shouldn't go. So why did God ask the people to walk around and around and around the city? Why did God ask them to do something that obviously did not contribute to the great victory that He alone was going to accomplish for them? Well, let's think back to that second puzzle. Why did God want them to wait for 7 days before solving this impossible problem? Probably so their trust in Him could grow. Okay, well, couldn't it make sense for God to ask us to do something that doesn't make sense to us in order to demonstrate that faith in Him? What if God asks us to do something that doesn't make sense so that we can show Him how much we trust Him? I mean, isn't that kind of what James said in our responsive reading? Didn't he say that faith without works is dead? Didn't he say it does no good to say we trust in God if we're not going to do what He tells us to do? Didn't he say that the way we express our faith in God is by doing what God tells us? Okay, think about it this way. What if God were to command you to do something that you want to do, or something that makes sense to you? Why would you do it? Well, sure, you'd do it because God told you, but you probably also would have done it anyway. Thou shalt love thy spouse on thy wedding day. That's easy. Thou shalt praise the Lord thy God when thou feelest thankful. Duh. No, it's only when God asks us to do something that doesn't make sense. It's only when God asks us to do something we wouldn't want to do otherwise. That's when we most clearly demonstrate our trust in Him. Thou shalt love thy spouse when thy spouse hath gotten on thy last nerve. Ooh. Thou shalt praise the Lord thy God when thou hast been beaten up or put in jail. That's what Paul and Silas did. That takes trust. That takes faith. And that's the sort of thing Rahab did too, isn't it? I mean, today's passage reminds us of that story that we read in chapter 2. Remember, Rahab placed her faith in God. She trusted that the people of God would indeed conquer Jericho, and she begged them to save her and her family when that happened. Now remember, that didn't make any sense to Rahab. No, the fact that those strong walls could be breached, that didn't make any sense. And it certainly wasn't anything she wanted to happen. She didn't want to have her whole town destroyed. She didn't want to have all her friends put to death. But she demonstrated her faith by protecting the spies who had come to see her in chapter 2, and by tying a cord in the window of her house so that she and her family could be identified in the melee. She trusted God, yes, but then she put her faith into action. How? By doing something that didn't make any sense to her. And come to think of it, isn't that the same thing Jesus did? Really all his life? I mean, did it make sense for Jesus to leave the comforts and joys of heaven to take on human flesh so he could be born in a barn and experience all the sorrows and temptations of this sinful world? Did that make sense? With all the power in heaven and on earth at his command, did it make sense for him to allow himself to be arrested and unfairly tried and beaten and crucified? Did it make sense? Did it make sense for Jesus to take upon himself the sins of a world full of people who despised him and who rejected him? Did it make sense for him, even at the moment of his death, to pray to the Father, "Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit," even though at that moment he was dying to satisfy the justice of the one to whom he was praying? None of that makes sense. Not to us. It didn't make any more sense than those people walking around Jericho 7 times. It didn't make any more sense than for Rahab to throw in her lot with a group of people who obviously could not conquer those impenetrable walls. But because the people of God were willing to obey God, even when it didn't make sense, they received an impossible blessing. Because Rahab was willing to obey God's messengers, she and her family were saved from destruction. And because Jesus was willing to give himself up to satisfy the justice of the Father, all who trust in him have been saved from the power of sin and death. So, as you look at those impossible problems that face you, and they're still there when you go back out those doors, as you look at those impossible problems this week, let's all resolve to trust God to solve those problems in his way, in his time. But as our waiting helps us build our faith, may our obedience to God, even in the things that don't make sense to us, may that demonstrate our faith. May that express our praise. And let's resolve to trust and obey the Lord as we take up our hymnals, and we'll turn to that very famous hymn number 318, Trust and Obey. We'll sing all 5 stanzas, and let us stand to sing.